So I found something in Exodus that is in the middle of an old story that we read all the time, but it's this new connection. And maybe you've already made this connection, but I think it's worth talking about. So, in Exodus, if you're not familiar with the Bible, Exodus is in the beginning of the Bible. It goes Genesis, Exodus for the books of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament, and there's this character. I say character, but he was a real human. His name's Moses, and he is well known. There's been movies about him. There's pop culture references about him. In Christianity, he's referenced a lot, and there's a whole narrative about Moses, and we're going to focus on one part of Moses, but I'm going to mention some other parts of his life. Um, Here's what you need to know for what we're going to talk about. So, God had a people, they were set apart, they were for himself, because those people exist on planet Earth, where there's just brokenness. They were in Egypt, and the Egyptians got scared basically of how the population of God's people was growing, and so they took them into slavery so they wouldn't get too powerful. And even within that, there were different things where the king was like, well, we're going to start killing the men, like as in the babies, because we don't want them to get too powerful. In that, you might have heard this story before where it's all poetic. There's a baby floating down the water, saved. It's found in the middle of the reeds. That's Moses. Moses is one of the little boys that should have been killed, and instead Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh, who was Egyptian, took one of Moses, who was the son of one of God's people, and she finds him floating in the river, and she's like, well, I can't help it, like I gotta take him in. And he grows up in the royal home basically, and where he was taught about all the things that you would learn being part of Pharaoh's family, and Pharaoh is who rules in Egypt. And he doesn't stay in Egypt though. When he's an adult, he ends up fleeing and running away from Egypt, and he goes out into the boonies. And I don't think that's biblically what you would call it officially, but that's what I call it. And he goes out into the boonies, and he ends up getting married, having kids, establishing a family. And then we imagine like a young Moses, but Moses was actually like 80 years old, depending on who you read. He was old though. He definitely wasn't like 20-year-old buckaroo. And he finds this burning bush, and so he goes up to it, and the burning bush is actually what God used to get his attention to then talk to him and call him. And God calls him, and he says, hey, like, I have a plan for you, and I need you, and I want to use you for this. And that is what we're going to talk about, and where I found the connection that I hadn't seen before. We talk about being called by God a lot. We talk about being purposed. We talk about being a people that were made for something bigger than, and I believe all those things. And because of that, Exodus 3 and Exodus 4, which is where Moses is called by God, is a place that I've referenced a lot, that people on my team have referenced a lot, that I've heard in church a lot. I actually thought of this connection when I was listening to somebody else that was at like a youth conference, talking about Exodus and talking about Moses being called. And which already is a whole story in itself. Because here's the deal, God calls Moses, right? And Moses is just me. I don't know about you, but he's me. He has all the God of the universe is talking to him. And it starts in Exodus 3, chapter 3, verse like 7 through 10. God has kind of his intro, and he's like, Moses, there's stuff going on with my people. I've seen it, I've heard their cries, I've listened to their prayers, I see it going on, and I want to do something about it. I'm sending you. And Moses, bless his little heart, his first protest starts in Exodus 3, verse 11. And he's like, who am I to go? And God, just being God and being all patient and a great dad, is like, I will be with you. Okay? So, like, you go. I know you're like, who am I to go? I'm not really going to tell you, Moses, that you are the number one best person in the world ever. Although you're created, you're purposed. Clearly, I believe in you. I'm sending you. But I will be with you. And then Moses still has more protests. He's like, are they really they're gonna ask like who the God who sent me, what his name is. And so God not only gives Moses a name, this name I am, but he also then goes on to say, hey, here are different things. Like, he gives him a promise. He promises him, I have notes that I'm looking at, because I want to make sure the Bible is a serious thing. I don't want to get it wrong. But he says, tell the people in Egypt who have been enslaved that I've been watching closely. He promises that the people are going to accept it when Moses says that. He also knows that the Egyptians are probably not going to be a big fan of losing all their slaves, and he's like, I will cause the Egyptians to let you guys leave. And he gives all these promises, and Moses is like, cool, 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 cool. What if they don't believe me though? And like, that's in Exodus 4 chapter 1. So it's literally, the Bible wasn't originally written in chapters, but we're literally going, like, we're extending into a whole other chapter, and Moses is still going with more excuses and things with fear. That's how I react too. And Moses is like, yeah, but what if they don't believe me? And God gives him two different miracles. And then he's like, okay, and in Exodus 4:10, he's like, well, what about speech? Like, I'm not good at talking. We don't know what this means. A lot of people are like, maybe Moses had a stutter. Whatever it was, God's like, who makes a mouth? Which I just really love that response. I half love it, and then I'm half like, ooh, how many times have I given an excuse like that to God? And God's like, anyways, I made your mouth. So, but then finally in Exodus 4:13, Moses just straight up says, like, he's like, honestly, Lord, he says, Lord, please send anyone else. And there's a teammate of mine, Noah, who points out, he's like, and then all of a sudden, that's the only time that you see God reacts, and it says God was angry with Moses. In chapter 4 of Exodus, verse 14, just kidding. Sorry, guys. In I'm still in chapter 3 over there. But in chapter 4, verse 14, it says, then the Lord became angry with Moses. And then he starts talking. He's like, all right, how about your brother Aaron? And then that's how Aaron becomes a spokesperson of Moses, and he still sends Moses. And that's a whole thing. I mean, I could talk just on that forever, and I basically have, because this is gonna be the first video. But God sits there and he's like, hey guys, I made you for something, Moses. And he doesn't get angry at any of the excuses, at any of the fear, at any of the questions. Even when Moses is like, what about my speech? And God's like, yeah, I made your mouth. He doesn't say it, I say it sarcastically. God didn't say it sarcastically, and he didn't say it with anger. But then when Moses says send someone else, God's like, hold on a second, I made you for something. Now I'm mad. Because you're trying to have somebody else take your place in literally what I created you for. And Moses, his life had been saved. There is one person in all of God's people, one person who he was supposed to die. He was saved. He was raised where Pharaoh himself was raised. God's like, there is one person's life that I stitched in that way for your purpose. And you're telling me to send someone else? And just all these excuses. And in that whole setup, there's already so much, and it is so loaded in how God has a purpose for us, and then we have all these excuses. And bless his heart. God is much bigger than a bless his heart. But God has all this patience and grace with us because he has purposed us, and he has stitched every single moment in our life so purposely for us to be used. And we say, please send someone else. And that's where God's like, listen, I didn't get mad until you said send someone else. And that's where I used to stop. And like, that in itself, we could sit and talk forever. And that's just the setup for what I found. But even that is so important to unpack. But that sets the baseline for this next part that I'm going to talk about. But maybe even just this was enough to hear. So I'm going to wrap it up here for the first video. Is God calling you to something that he made you for? And are you saying yes, or are you saying send someone else? because he's okay with your excuses. He's okay with your fear. He's okay with you being like, wait, but how's this going to work? And what about this? He's like, I have an answer for that, and I'm there, and I'm going to go with you, and here's my name, and here's promises, and here's the assurance. Remember the kingdom perspective? Like, I'm the one that made your mouth, so like that's even a real thing. But I made your mouth. And he has an answer, and he has a dialogue with us. He's okay with engaging in relationship when we have all this hesitation when we're called. But it's a whole different story when we say, send someone else, don't use me.